Hello ladies and gentle ladies, welcome back to another multi-loader Minecraft modding tutorial for 26.1, and in this tutorial we're going to be adding Datagen to our mod. So first of all, what is Datagen? So Datagen effectively allows us to generate all of our assets and all of our data files. So if we come into our project here and we come into common, you see in our resources here we have all these assets and data. So we have our block state files, we have our item state files, we have our lang, we have our model files, we have our tags in here in the Minecraft directory, and we have the loot table as well. Now the purpose of Datagen is to allow us to programmatically generate these files, so effectively generate the data, hence Datagen. So this is obviously very useful, and it actually saves us tons of time. We don't have to write JSON files anymore. Now I will say there are certain circumstances where you will still want JSON files. So for example, if you have a custom model for your block or item, then you will still need to have that JSON file. Or maybe for more complex block states in the future, you may still need to create that by hand. But the idea is that we try and automate as much of this as possible. So let's go ahead and get started. So Datagen is going to be a little bit different to what we do usually in MultiLoader. So Datagen is the one thing where we're only going to do this on one specific loader. And the reason is because there's just no point doing it on both loaders. Generally, you're not generating loader specific assets or data files. And so we only need to go ahead and do it on one loader. Now the loader we are going to do this for is NeoForge, and the reason for that is just that NeoForge has a lot more loader specific data than Fabric does. Other than that, it wouldn't really make a difference. Now you could choose to do this on both loaders if you wish, and I actually have already recorded this tutorial, but I did it on both loaders. I've decided to go back and we are just going to do it on NeoForge just because it's so much simpler, it saves so much time, and there's just no point having it on both loaders. But if you want, you can. You just have to once again go ahead and abstract it in your common, but we're not going to be touching the common at all today is the plan. So that's how we're going to start. Now I should probably clarify, we are going to touch the common at the very start, and that is to go ahead and delete our existing assets and data. So as I say, don't delete anything we're not going to be able to generate. So that will be custom block models, that will be custom item models, and that will be our textures, of course. So we're going to delete everything else. So block states, those are going to be deletable. Item states, those are going to be deletable. Lang, that's very deletable. Models, for me, I don't have any custom ones yet, so I'm going to go ahead and delete those. And then we're just going to leave assets tutorial mod textures. That's fine. And then I know for a fact I can just delete the entire data directory. That will almost always be the case. So you can probably just safely delete that and that will be fine. Now, obviously, as long as you have everything on Git, if you do accidentally delete something that you don't want to have deleted, then that's perfectly fine because you can just go back into Git and you can retrieve it. So you won't have lost anything as long as you are committing and pushing to Git fairly frequently. So let's go ahead and get started. So we can just completely minimize the Fabric package because we're not going to be touching it today. Instead, we're going to come into NeoForge and we're going to want to come into the build.gradle that is inside of the NeoForge directory. So this one right here. And in here, we just need to change a couple things because we want our resources to generate inside of the common package. Right now, if we ran Datagen on the NeoForge side, it would actually go ahead and create those in the NeoForge package, which isn't really ideal. So ideally we have those be common. So what we need to go ahead and do is we need to come and first of all just delete this line right here for sourceSets.main.resources. Just delete that line, we don't need that whatsoever. Then what we're going to do is we're going to come up to this line inside of the data block. We're going to find program arguments.add all, and we're first of all just going to split this line up. So after this dash dash all, I'm going to put a new line, and after just before the dash dash existing, we're going to put a new line as well, and then we're just going to modify this ever so slightly. So what we're going to do here is where we have the file for output, we're going to do root project dot project, and then we're going to do parentheses, and inside the parentheses we're going to put some quotes, and we're going to put colon common inside those quotes, and then we're going to put another dot. And then we're just going to copy that and we're going to put that on the line below before file as well. So what this means is that rather than it's currently targeting the current project, which is the NeoForge one, it will now go ahead to the root project, which is like our entire mod folder, and it will grab the common project, which is this one right here, and then it just specifies that it will generate to there, and it will also look for resources in there as well. So that's basically what that is for. Now we can delete this line here now because that's not necessarily necessary. And then we also do actually need to come back into our common package for a second, because we need to modify this slightly so that it knows where our resources are going to be. So we're going to find the dependencies block, and then down here we're going to do source sets dot main, and then we're going to do dot resources, and we're going to specify that the source directory will be source / generated / resources. Then we need to define the common resources directory. So def common resources directory is, I'm just going to call that dir, by the way. And we're going to set that to layout.build.directory.dir. And we're just going to pass in generated / common resources, just like that. Then we're going to define a function to sync them. So we're going to do def sync common resources, and yeah, Copilot has gone ahead and basically sorted that out for us. So that is task.register, and then that takes in sync common resources, and then that is the sync task, and then we're saying that comes from sourcesets.main.resources, and it goes into the common resources directory. Then inside of the artifacts, so we need to find the artifacts down here. We need to go ahead and first of all remove this line here, and we're instead going to say that the common resources will instead be the common resources dir, and we're just going to say that that is built by sync common resources. So it will basically require that task to build our resources, and that is all we need to go ahead and do there. So we can reload this if we want, but obviously right now that's not going to change anything. Now what we will do very quickly is in the gitignore down here, we're going to come to the very bottom and we're going to add a .cache in here, and that is because NeoForge generates a bunch of cache files when you run the Datagen, and we just don't want those to be committed to Git. So we go ahead and just add that to gitignore. Okay, now what we can go ahead and do inside of our NeoForge package in our source main java dev 30 tutorial mod, we're going to create a new class, and we're going to call this tutorial mod neo, we'll just call it tutorial mod Datagen actually. Okay, this will be a final class, and it will have a private constructor, and then we're going to have two static methods in here. So we're going to have a public static void on gather client data, and that is going to take in a gather data event dot client, which we'll call the event, and then we're going to have basically the exact same thing on gather server data, which will take in the gather data event dot server. So this will be for generating our data directory, so source main resources data, and this will be for creating our client directory, which will be source main resources assets. Now it actually won't be source main because it's not going to come into this resources directory here. It's actually going to come into a source, and then there will be a generated directory here that it will go into instead. Now, once we have done that, we need to just go ahead and tell NeoForge that these events, these are effectively events, by the way. So we need to tell NeoForge that these exist. So we need to go into the tutorial mod class inside of NeoForge, and we just need to come below common class.init, and we're going to do event bus.add listener, and we're going to do tutorial mod Datagen : on gather client data. And we just need to do the exact same thing for the on gather server data. Okay, now once we have done that, we can now go ahead and actually create our Datagen providers. So we're going to come to dev 30 tutorial mod inside of the NeoForge project, and we're going to create a new package, which I'm going to call Datagen. And then inside of here, we're going to create a new class. So let's go ahead and start with the models, since I think those are the most effective. So we're going to create a tutorial model provider. And this class is going to extend model provider. And then it's going to want a constructor that matches the super. Now we're going to want to choose the first one. And then in the super here, we're just going to pass in constants.modID as the second parameter. And then we just want to override the register models method. Going to get rid of that super line there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to actually go ahead and register our models. So first of all, let's go ahead and register our item models, and then we'll go ahead and generate our block models. So let's go ahead and do item models dot generate flat item. We're going to pass in mod items dot example item, and we need to call .get on that, and then we can just pass in the actual template that we use. So for us, that is going to be model templates dot flat item. And you'll see inside of model templates there are a bunch of other templates that you could be using, in which case you will have to actually use a different generate method. But you'll see there are tons of different generate methods for all the different things that you could think about needing. Then we are just going to go ahead and copy paste that, and we're going to change that to example item 2, just so that that is generated for both of our items. Then we can go ahead and do the same thing for our block. So for our block, we need to do block models dot create trivial cube. So inside of create trivial cube, we're going to do mod blocks dot example block dot block dot get, and that just gets us the block from the block with item registry handle, and then that gets the block from the block registry handle that was stored inside of the block with item registry handle. Now once we have created that, let's quickly go ahead and just hook this up into our Datagen class, and we're going to call event.createProvider tutorial model provider : new. Now that we have done that, we can now go ahead and create our second provider. So this one is going to be for the English language. So we're going to create a new class, and we're going to call this tutorial mod English language provider. This is going to go ahead and just extend language provider, and then we are going to add the translations method that it wants us to add, and then it also wants us to create the constructor as well. Now the constructor here, we are going to get rid of these two parameters for the mod ID and the locale, and we're just going to pass these directly into the super. So that will be constants.mod ID, and then for the locale we're going to have en_us. So this is effectively what the name of your JSON file will be called. So we're going to have en_us.json. If you remember, in the items tutorial we talked more about this locale here, but we're going to be using en_us. Then what we need to do is we need to actually add the translations in here. So inside of here you can see there is the add method that we have. So we can go ahead and just call add, and we can pass in mod items dot example item dot get, and we're just going to call that example item, and then we can do add again. We can do mod items dot example item 2 dot get, and we can pass in example item 2. Then we have our block as well, so we can go ahead and do add, and we can do mod blocks dot example block dot get dot block dot get, and then we can pass in example block, and then we can also do add, and we can do mod blocks dot example block dot item dot get, and we can do example block again, which just makes sure the item will have that exact same name. Now to save us a little bit of time in the future, we're also going to add another method in here. Now this will be a private method, and this will be void, and we're going to call this add, and this will take in a component from net.minecraft.network.chat.component, and then we're just going to add a string value, and in here all we're going to do is we're going to say if component dot get contents is instance of a translatable contents, then we're going to call add, and we're going to add in translatable contents dot get key, and then we're going to add in the value. And effectively, the reason we're adding this method is because later on, when we're going to have translatable strings inside of our code, we're going to want to be able to add them to our Datagen. And so this is the method that we need to be able to do that. Okay, now that we have finished our language provider, we can now go back into our Datagen class, and inside of the client, we can do event.createProvider, and we can just go ahead and do tutorial mod English language provider : new. The next thing we can go ahead and do is we can do the tag provider for the block tags. So we're going to create another new class, and we're going to do tutorial mod block tags provider, and this is going to go ahead and extend block tag provider, and then we can go ahead and implement the methods that it wants us to add, and then it also wants us to add a constructor as well, where we can go ahead and once again just get rid of that string mod ID parameter and just pass that once again directly to the super. So once we have gone ahead and done that, we can now call the tag method in here, and we're going to start off with the mineable pickaxe tag. So we're going to do tag, and we're going to pass in block tags dot mineable with pickaxe. So this is the vanilla mineable pickaxe tag, and then we're just going to call add, and we're going to pass in mod blocks dot example block dot block dot get. Now I just do want to say, if you want to add more blocks afterwards, then you can just chain this method. So after you've called that one, you can then just call add again, and you can pass in your other blocks. Alternatively, this is a var args, so you can pass in multiple in here. So you can pass in another one, and etc, and you could pass in as many as you want afterwards. For us, however, that is the only block we are adding to that tag for now. Then what we want to do is we want to do the needs iron tool tag as well. So we're going to call tag again, and we're going to pass in block tags dot needs iron tool, and then we just need to call the add method on here with our example block again, exactly the same as the one before. Once again, you can just chain this if you want. There are also other methods in here as well, so you can do add optional, you can also add specific tags to the tag, and a lot more as well. For us, however, this is all we're going to go ahead and need. And then inside of our Datagen, we're once again going to add this in here. This time this is going to be in the server data, so we're going to do event.createProvider, and we're going to go ahead and do tutorial mod block tag provider : new. The final thing that we're going to want to go ahead and do here is the loot table provider. Now this one is going to be a little bit more complicated, but I'm sure we can figure it out. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to create a new class, and we're going to call this tutorial mod loot table provider. This is just going to extend loot table provider. Now here it's going to ask us to add the constructor. We will do that, and then this is where things get a little bit more complicated. So first of all, inside of the set of resource key of loot table, this is basically the required loot tables that are required for this provider. Now for us, we're not going to have any of these, and for the foreseeable future, we're also not going to have any of those. So then in the super here, we can just pass in sets.of, as we don't have any. Next, we have the sub providers. So these are effectively the different providers that your loot tables support. So for example, you may have a provider for chests, you may have a provider for entities, you may have a provider for blocks. For now, we're just going to have a provider for blocks, and that is because obviously we only have blocks in the mod. So we can go ahead and just remove that parameter, and we can just go ahead and pass in here a list.of. Now for now, we'll just leave that empty. We'll come back to that in a second. I am just going to go ahead and clean this up. So I'm going to go ahead and new line all of these and just make this a little bit easier to read, because this one line here is going to get a bit bigger in a second. Now that we have done that, let's quickly go ahead and add this to our Datagen first. So let's just do event.createProvider, and we're just going to do tutorial mod loot table provider : new. Then inside of here, let's go ahead and create our sub provider entry. So we're going to go ahead and do a new sub provider entry. This will first of all go ahead and take in the actual sub provider. So we'll create that in a second. For now, we'll just leave that blank and we'll put a comma in there. And then we're going to pass in the actual type that this sub provider is. So for us, that's going to be a block. So we're going to do loot context param sets dot block. And you can see there's a bunch of other different loot table types in here as well, but for us that is just a block. Next, let's go ahead and actually create this sub provider. So we're going to come down here and we're going to create a private static final class, and we will just call this tutorial mod block loot sub provider, and that's going to extend block loot sub provider. In here we can go ahead and create a private constructor, but it's going to ask us to go ahead and implement the methods first. So we'll implement that generate method, and then we'll go ahead and add the constructor that it wants. It actually wants us to have its package private here. That's fine, we can do that as well. Now we're going to want to clear out these parameters again. So once again, let's just get rid of these first two parameters completely. Here, first of all, we have the explosion resistance. Now, I honestly don't really know what this is for. I think my understanding is that this is a set of items in your mod that are explosion resistant. I think, I'm not entirely sure though, but for us that will just be an empty set, so we'll just do set.of. But obviously if you have elements you want to add in there, then you can just pass in, mod items.example_item.get, for example. But for us that would just be an empty set. And then we have the enabled features. You're just going to want to set this to feature flags.default flags, as we're not going to worry about that. That's kind of more of a vanilla thing, so we just want to set that to default flags. Next we have the generate method. So this is where you actually add all of your loot tables. Now, since our block is a very normal loot table, we can just do the drop self method, and we can pass in mod blocks.example_block.block.get, and that'll go ahead and handle all of the rest for us. Now you see there are other drop methods you can go ahead and actually use. There's a bunch of different methods, so if you just press Control Space, you can scroll down and you can see all of the different methods that you can choose to use. You have, for example, like drop other. So if you want your item to, if you want your block to drop an item that is different to the block itself, you can go ahead and do that. You also have a ORs function in here as well to go ahead and create an OR drop, as you can see. And yeah, there's a bunch of other ones in there as well. For us, we're just going to use drop self. Then in the sub provider here, we can now go ahead and pass in our tutorial mod block loot sub provider : new, and that will go ahead and handle the rest for us. Now later on, when we want to add more sub providers, all we need to do is put a comma here and add in a new sub provider entry and pass in the specific provider, and also pass in what type of that would be. So for example, the next one we're actually going to be adding in here is going to be the entity provider, but we'll come back to that when the time comes, and then obviously you'll create your block loot sub provider as well. Now let's go ahead and come back into our Datagen. So this is all now fine, and I believe that should be everything. So what we can now go ahead and do is we come to our Gradle tab on the right here. Let's make sure we've gone ahead and pressed sync all Gradle projects, since we have made changes to our build.gradle files. And then we can come into the NeoForge one, we can come into tasks, we can come down here and we can go to mod development, and you'll see that we now have a run data. Now this may have actually existed for you beforehand, it did for me, but I'm not sure if it does for everyone. I don't really know where it came from, but you can now go ahead and run this task, and this should go ahead, run all of our Datagen and generate all of our JSON files to be exactly the same as they were before. So let's go ahead and test this and see if it works or not. Okay, so you see that that has gone ahead and generated our resources here, but it hasn't gone ahead and generated any of our data. And the reason it's doing this is because inside of the build.gradle on NeoForge, you'll see that we have specified client data. So what this means is that it's actually only going to go ahead and generate the client resources for us, and it won't generate the server ones. Now, I may be wrong, but at least as far as I can see, NeoForge doesn't have a way to run both client and server Datagen. Now there is a somewhat solution to this. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take our onGather server data. We're going to take the things out of there. We're just going to put them in our onGather client data. And then we're just going to come into our main class here and we're going to get rid of that server data. So you see that it has gone ahead and ran, but we do have this exception here. And that is because for some weird reason, and I don't really know why it does this, but for some reason we have to actually override get known blocks inside of our loot table provider. I don't know why NeoForge does this. This is just like a weird NeoForge quirk. But what we can go ahead and do inside of get known blocks is we can actually grab our deferred register. So what we can do is we can come into our NeoForge registry helper. We can just make this blocks field here public, and then what that allows us to do is return NeoForge registry helper dot blocks, and then we can just go ahead and do get entries. We can stream, and then we can map, and then we need to do entry, and we need to cast that to a block, and we need to say entry dot value, and then we can just do a to list, and what that should do is that should go ahead and get the known blocks inside of our mod. And as that is running, you will now see that all of our resources should get generated in the common source generated resources. So we can see in here that we have our assets and we also have our data with all of our resources generated. So if we now go ahead and we can run the NeoForge client, and we can also go ahead and run the Fabric client at the same time. And hopefully we should be able to see that inside the game, everything works. Okay, so here we are. So let's go ahead, single player. Let's load into our worlds as well. And hopefully we should be able to see that everything is here. So here we are in Fabric, and we can see that everything's there. And we also should be able to give ourselves our items as well. So tutorial mod example item and tutorial mod example item 2, of course, will be exactly the same. And we can come in here and we can also see that we have our example item. Also just give ourselves tutorial mod example item 2 again as well. Place our block down, make sure that works, which it does. And yeah, everything should work. I guess let's just quickly test our loot table as well. And yeah, we can see that that works perfectly fine. So yeah, that is going to be it for this tutorial. I hope you all enjoyed and found it useful. If you did, please do be sure to give it a like and subscribe. If you have any problems, obviously join the Discord, which is linked in the description down below. And in the next tutorial, we're actually going to be going over entities. So yeah, I will see you all then. Goodbye.